thank you very much for having me in this interview. I'm Raj Bala. I'm the Brenneson Distinguished Professor at the University of Kansas Law School. I'm also a senior advisor at Dentons in Kansas City, and I write a column on point for Bloomberg Quint in Mumbai.
Good evening, Professor Raj Bala, and thank you very much again for agreeing for me to interview you on this companion piece of the book. Okay, without further ado, I do know that your time is limited, so I'm going to quickly jump into the question. As COVID-19 has accelerated the digital revolution and the so-called fourth industrial revolution, which emerging technology do you think will accelerate the contraction in global trade, and what should the business community be doing in preparation for this change?
That's an excellent question, and it's a complex one. Let me try and at least offer a few different perspectives. The first is 3D printing is perhaps an obvious example where we would see a diminution in production, exportation, cross-border trade in merchandise if we are approaching a world in which more and more people have access to 3D printers. They can obtain the merchandise they want right from their desk in their office or their home. So for example, if someone wants to buy cutlery or even small furniture, that can come out of a 3D printer in their home or office. Second, I think, piece of this would be robots. We're seeing more and more the substitution of labor by capital, and here the capital are the robots. They're doing more and more production and are part of the supply chain, and that at least has an effect on employment. It could actually stimulate goods production and trade, depending on the sector and depending on consumer demand. That leads to a third point, consumer demand or aggregate demand. As populations age in many developed countries, Japan, Korea, and the US, Europe, the amount of goods that the elderly consume may fall, or at least the pattern of what they're consuming changes. And so that kind of goes in the other direction, suggesting that we may see some diminution of trade as a result of just aging. And then finally, to return to your starting point about the digital revolution, in the services area, in services trade, we are seeing more and more use of algorithms. For example, in banking and securities regulation, what used to be known as program trading, or in the legal sector, where sometimes civil discovery or even perhaps editing can be done using algorithms. And there again, we're seeing a substitution away from labor, in this case, professional services, in favor of something digitized. And that could result in a diminution of trade in professional services. So there's no one easy answer to your excellent and complex question, but those are some trends I think we're seeing.
Thank you very much, Professor. And speaking about the acceleration of digital revolution and services trade that you just talked about, I know there's been several attempts to have some sort of an international agreement on services to no avail so far. I know the last such attempt at a multilateral level was TISA, Trade in Services Agreement, back in 2013. Do you think the time is right in light of COVID-19 to revisit one such agreement?
I do not think the time is right to revisit the Trade and Services Agreement, TISA, at the multilateral level. I don't think there's a sufficient degree of interest among all 164 WTO members to forge a multilateral TISA. I think it's possible that it could be resurrected as a plurilateral agreement, and that's where, as your question rightly stated, that's where it was sort of left off a few years ago. However, I think that there are stronger efforts being made at, for example, the free trade agreement level or the customs union level, where we're seeing, for example, in USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, we're seeing strong services chapters, and including special chapters on financial services and indeed also on e-commerce. I also think that the time is not ripe at the WTO level for a multilateral TISA, because I think there are two far higher priorities. One is the fishing subsidies agreement, which affects millions, if not hundreds of millions of people in developing countries if we could get to a fishing subsidies agreement. And second, of course, is reform and the rebirth of the WTO appellate body.
Thank you. Now, at this point, it is widely understood that the increasing struggle between the US and China for global leadership in economics and technology sphere will likely persist, at least in the foreseeable future. Even in a Biden-Harris administration, what should the business community be doing to mitigate the likely impact of this foreseeable risk?
Well, the narrow answer to that question, I would suggest, is to reconfigure and rethink and reconfigure supply chains, to try and conceive of the Sino-American trade war, which could become a Cold War. Some say it already is, some say it's not. To rethink their supply chains so that they are hedged for this conflict. If supply chains are running from China to the US and businesses anticipate that the trade war is gonna worsen and may become a Cold War if it's not already, then they want to look at moving those supply chains to countries, say, such as India or Vietnam or Thailand or the Philippines, or even bringing them back to the US or Canada, whichever the country of the company involved is, the home country. I think also they should, so in other words, the way to think about it is that the trade war and the possibility of its exacerbation is now a political and a legal risk that needs to be thought through in terms of supply chain locations and management. Likewise, they have to be aware, businesses, of trade sanctions and export controls, which do apply to China, particularly in the aftermath of the Chinese Communist Party's imposition of the national security law on Hong Kong. And finally, I would suggest to the business community, going back to the wording of your question, that the struggle for leadership is what underlies it is quite possibly ideological competition, that the US and China are really offering two different systems of government. They're offering two different conceptions of the relationship between individuals and government. And those systems are likely to compete for some time, at least under the present leaderships in both countries.
Well, I think those were excellent answers, Professor Raj Bala, and thank you very much again for agreeing to do the interview.